The wind didn't just blow across the Wyoming plains, it hunted. It was a merciless, invisible predator that clawed at Mara's thin shawl and bit into her skin with teeth made of ice. She walked through a blinding white abyss, her head bowed low, her body leaning forward at a sharp angle as if she were trying to push through a solid wall of iron. She had lost track of how many days she'd been walking. Maybe 3. Maybe 4. Time becomes a blur when your feet are bleeding and the cold feels like 1,000 serrated knives carving into your bones. Her boots were a tragedy. The thin soles had split weeks ago, and now she felt every sharp stone and frozen rut through the layers of damp rags she had stuffed inside. Her left heel was a raw, weeping mess, the blood frozen into a stiff, dark crust against her socks. In her trembling arms, she clutched a small bundle of clothes, everything she owned in a world that had decided she owned nothing. The mountains to the west rose like jagged, indifferent teeth, their peaks already buried under a snow that promised a winter capable of killing anyone caught without a roof. The sky above was a bruised purple, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on the world until the horizon vanished. "You cannot stop," she rasped, her voice a ghost of a sound. "If you stop, the cold takes you." She thought of Silver Creek, the town she had fled. It was a place where men lost their souls to cards and women lost their choices to hunger. She had been a ghost there, working in a boarding house for a woman who carried a Bible in her right hand and a ledger of sins in her left. When Mara could no longer pay the respectability tax, she was tossed into the street like a bag of refuse. "Respectable," she whispered bitterly. To the people of Silver Creek, Mara was low status, a woman of the shadows, a person whose life had no more value than the dust on their boots. As the afternoon light thinned into a watery, terrifying dusk, she saw it. A thin, gray ribbon of smoke rising ahead. It was faint, nearly torn away by the howling gale, but it was there, a line of hope in a world of white. Where there was smoke, there was fire. And where there was fire, there was a chance to see tomorrow. She forced her legs to move, stumbling toward the shape that emerged from the gloom. It was a cabin, rough-hewn and weathered to the color of iron. A small corral stood nearby, where 2 horses huddled against the wind. There were no neighbors. No help if she chose the wrong door. But the plains offered only death. She reached the door, her hand hovering over the rough wood. She knew what men thought when they saw a woman alone, broken, and desperate. She knew they saw an opportunity to take. But the frost was in her marrow now. She knocked. The sound was a pathetic whisper. She knocked again, harder, her knuckles splitting. "Please," she whimpered. The latch clicked. The door swung inward, and a wall of warmth hit her so hard she nearly fainted. A tall man filled the frame, silhouetted against the orange glow of a roaring stove. He wore a heavy wool coat, a battered hat pulled low, and in his right hand, he held a Winchester rifle with a casual, terrifying competence. He didn't speak. He scanned the darkness behind her, looking for a trap, a husband, or a gang. Seeing only the empty, frozen wasteland, he looked down at her. He saw her blue lips, her tattered clothes, and the way she vibrated with exhaustion. Something flickered in his dark, unreadable eyes, not pity, but a grim resignation. "Come in," he said, his voice like gravel under a heavy wagon wheel. "Before you let the heat out." Mara stumbled inside, her legs finally buckling. He didn't catch her, but he gripped her arm to steady her against the frame. "Sit," he ordered, nodding toward a small wooden table. The cabin was sparse but clean. It smelled of cedar and coffee. He handed her a tin cup of water and set a bowl of thick stew before her. She ate like an animal, the heat of the food making her ache. Finally, he leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Where'd you come from?" "Silver Creek," she managed. "For days walking." He looked at her bruises, the way she flinched when he moved his boots. "You're running from something." Mara looked at the narrow bed in the corner. She knew the rules of the world. Nothing was free. Not heat, not food, not life. She stood up, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the table. She looked at this lone cowboy, this man who seemed to have carved himself out of the mountain. "Mr. Turner," she whispered, her voice cracking with shame. "I'm not worth much. I have no money. But I'll do anything for a roof. I'll spread my legs for a warm bed if that's what it takes." The silence that followed was deafening. The wind outside held its breath. Eli Turner's jaw tightened until the bone looked ready to snap. His hands balled into fists, and for a terrifying second, Mara thought he would strike her for her impudence. Instead, he looked at her with a flash of pure, cold anger, not at her, but at the world that had taught her that her body was her only currency. "No," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Not in this house. You'll sleep in that bed because you're a human being, and you'll keep your dignity because I'm not the animal you think I am." The rejection hung in the air, heavier than the blizzard rattling the window panes. Mara felt a wave of humiliation so cold it rivaled the frost she'd just escaped. She had spent years in a world where every kindness had a hidden price tag, where a warm meal was traded for a bruise, and a roof was bought with the pieces of her soul. When Eli Turner said, no, she didn't hear a man of honor, she heard a man who thought she wasn't even worth the trade. She shrank into the wooden chair, her hair falling like a curtain of tangled silk to hide the tears she refused to let fall. She felt smaller than the dust on the floorboards, a woman stripped of everything, including her only perceived value. But the silence wasn't mocking. Eli didn't laugh, and he didn't leer. He moved across the cabin with a quiet, measured grace, his heavy boots thudding softly on the cedar planks. He reached into a wooden crate and pulled out a heavy, moth-eaten wool blanket, tossing it onto the narrow cot against the far wall. "The bed is yours," he repeated, his voice losing its gravelly edge and taking on a tone of weary command. "I've spent enough nights sleeping on the hard ground to know a chair is a luxury. You're shaking so hard the tin cup is rattling. Get under the covers before the fever takes you." Mara looked at him, her eyes wide and wet. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why help me? I have nothing to give you." Eli stopped. He stood by the glowing stove, the light casting long, dramatic shadows across his scarred face. He looked like a monument to a forgotten era of chivalry, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and decided to be the opposite of it. "A person either gives shelter or they don't," he said, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "If there's a price on a man's mercy, then it isn't mercy at all, it's just another business transaction. And I'm done with business." He gestured toward the bed again. "Sleep, Mara. The world will still be broken in the morning, but you don't have to be." For the first time in years, Mara felt the tension leave her shoulders. She lay down on the cot, the scent of cedar and old wood acting like a sedative. She watched Eli as he sat in his high-backed chair, his Winchester rifle leaning against his knee. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at the door, a silent sentinel guarding a woman the rest of the world had discarded. "You don't have to stay awake," she murmured, her voice thick with exhaustion. "I do," he replied, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the dark corners of the room. "Because someone knocked on my door in the middle of a storm and told me she was willing to give up her dignity just for a roof. That means the world out there has been hunting you, and I'm keeping watch for both of us." Hours passed in a blur of warmth and the rhythmic whistling of the wind. Mara drifted into a deep sleep, but it was shattered by a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was the rhythmic, heavy beat of galloping hooves, not two horses, but several. The vibration traveled through the frozen earth and into the cabin walls. Eli was on his feet before the first horse neighed. He didn't panic, he moved with the surgical precision of a man who had been born on a battlefield. He extinguished the lantern with a sharp puff of breath, plunging the cabin into a world of gray shadows and orange embers. "Stay low," he hissed, his voice a low vibration. "Under the bed. Now." Mara scrambled to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Is it them?" she gasped. The men from Silver Creek? Eli didn't answer. He was at the window, pulling the heavy curtain back just a fraction of an inch. Outside, through the swirling snow, 3 silhouettes emerged from the gloom. They were large men on powerful horses, their coats slick with ice, their faces hidden by low-slung hats. They didn't look like travelers, they looked like hunters. One of them, a man with a voice like a rusted hinge, shouted over the gale. "Turner! Open up! We know the girl is in there. Wade Carter doesn't like it when people walk off with his property." Eli's grip on the rifle tightened until his knuckles turned white. He looked back at Mara, who was huddled in the shadows, her eyes wide with terror. In that moment, the reveal began to unfold. He wasn't just a lone cowboy, he was a wall. He was a man who had once commanded legions, a man who had lost his status because he refused to treat humans like property. He looked at the door, then back at the woman the world called worthless. "You aren't property, Mara," he whispered, a dangerous glint appearing in his dark eyes. "And they're about to find out that this cabin is the most expensive ground they've ever tried to tread on." He stepped toward the door, his shadow looming large against the logs, ready to serve a brand of justice the plains had long forgotten. The air inside the cabin had turned from a sanctuary of warmth to a pressurized chamber of cold dread. Outside, the 3 riders circled like vultures, their horses' hooves crunching through the frozen crust of the snow. The man with the voice like a rusted hinge, Silas, didn't wait for an invitation. He pounded a heavy, gloved fist against the timber door, the sound echoing like a funeral drum. "Turner! Don't make this difficult. We know the girl is in there. She's a thief and a runaway, and Wade Carter wants his due. Open this door and step aside, and maybe we'll leave you with enough teeth to eat your supper." Mara was huddled beneath the frame of the heavy oak bed, her fingers digging into the cedar floorboards until her nails bled. Every taunt from Silas felt like a lash across her back. "It's my fault," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently it was barely audible over the wind. "Mr. Turner, please, let me go. I'm not worth your life. They'll kill you, and then they'll take me anyway. I've lived in the dirt so long, I'm used to the taste. Don't die for a woman the world has already forgotten." She started to crawl out, her eyes fixed on the door, ready to surrender herself to the wolves to save the man who had shown her the only spark of kindness she'd known in a decade. Eli didn't look at her, but his hand shot out, catching her shoulder with a grip as firm as a mountain root. "Sit down," he commanded, his voice no longer just a gravelly rasp, but a sharp, biting snap of authority. He didn't look like a weary hermit anymore. His posture had straightened, his shoulders squaring under the wool coat as if he were back in uniform. He moved to the gun rack, but he didn't grab the Winchester first. Instead, he pulled a heavy iron bar across the door and began checking the perimeter of the room with the calculated efficiency of a master tactician. He was measuring distances, checking sight lines, and calculating the wind speed through the cracks in the logs. "Turner! We're losing our patience," Silas bellowed from the snow. "You're just a broken-down soldier hiding in a hole. You think you're a hero? You're a failure who couldn't even keep his rank. Send out the trash, or we'll burn this shack to the ground with both of you in it." Silas's men laughed, a cruel, high-pitched sound that cut through the night. They saw an old man and a broken woman. They saw an easy mark. They didn't see the lion they had just cornered. They didn't realize that Eli Turner wasn't hiding from the world because he was weak, he was hiding because he was trying to keep the monster he used to be under lock and key. Eli finally turned to Mara, his dark eyes burning with a cold, blue fire. "Listen to me, and listen close," he whispered. "In a moment, the world is going to get very loud. You stay on this floor. Do not move for anything. You are not trash, and you are not nothing. You are the reason I'm remembering how to fight." He handed her a heavy, brass-weighted poker from the stove. "If the door breaks and I'm not standing, you use this. Not to plead, not to beg, but to survive. Do you hear me?" Mara looked into his eyes and saw something she had never seen in a man before, not desire, not pity, but total, unwavering respect. She nodded, her fear suddenly replaced by a strange, cold resolve. Eli stepped to the window and pulled the shutter back just an inch. The moonlight reflected off the snow, illuminating Silas, who was now holding a torch, the orange flames licking at the freezing air. "Last chance, Eli!" Silas screamed. Eli didn't shout back. He didn't waste his breath on threats. He simply raised the Winchester, adjusted his breathing until his heart beat in slow, rhythmic thuds, and spoke to the darkness. "You boys should have stayed in the creek," he murmured. Then, with the grace of a predator, he pulled the trigger. The instant karma of Silas's arrogance was about to be paid in lead, and the lone cowboy was the one collecting the debt. The crack of the Winchester didn't just break the silence, it shattered the reality of the three men outside. The first bullet didn't hit Silas, it took the torch clean out of his hand, sending the flaming bundle tumbling into a deep snowdrift. Darkness reclaimed the yard, punctuated only by the dying orange hiss of the extinguished fire. Silas scrambled back, his horse rearing in a panic. "He's shooting. The old man is actually shooting," he screamed, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp fear that replaced his earlier bravado. He had expected a trembling hermit, he had found a sniper. Inside the cabin, the smell of burnt gunpowder filled the air, sharp, metallic, and strangely grounding. Mara lay flat against the floorboards, the vibrations of the shot rattling through her chest. She looked up and saw Eli. He wasn't the man she had met at the door anymore. He moved with a terrifying, fluid efficiency, sliding from one window to another without making a sound. He didn't look like a man defending a shack, he looked like a soldier holding a fortress. "They're splitting up," Eli whispered, more to himself than to her. "One to the corral, one to the back. They think they can flank me. What do I do?" Mara asked, her voice shaking but her eyes fixed on him. For the first time, she wasn't looking for a place to hide, she was looking for a way to stand. Eli reached into the pocket of his heavy coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound pouch of ammunition. He tossed it to her. "Keep these dry. If I call for a reload, you have them ready. And Mara? Don't look at the floor. Look at the door. If it moves, you tell me." It was a simple task, a small piece of trust, but to Mara, it felt like being handed a crown. He was treating her like a partner, not a burden. Outside, a second shot rang out, this one from Silas's man, Miller. The bullet tore through the thin log wall, sending a spray of splinters across the room. Mara flinched, but she didn't scream. She watched Eli. He didn't even blink. He waited for the flash of the next muzzle, then he leaned out and fired a single, calculated shot. A cry of agony erupted from behind the corral fence. Miller slumped into the snow, his leg shattered. The low-status cowboy had just neutralized a professional killer with the ease of a man swatting a fly. The reveal was becoming clear, Eli Turner was a master of the long game. Silas, realizing his men were being picked off by a ghost in a wool coat, lost his nerve. "You think you're tough, Turner? Wade Carter has 20 more men. He'll have your head on a spike by morning." He fired blindly at the cabin, his bullets thudding harmlessly into the heavy timber. But then, the back door groaned. The third man, a silent brute named Galt, had used the distraction to reach the rear entrance. He kicked the door with a force that made the hinges scream. The wood splintered, and for a second, the cold night air rushed in like a flood. Mara didn't wait for Eli. She didn't wait for permission. She saw Galt's shadow cross the threshold, his hand reaching for a heavy revolver. She felt the poker in her hand, the cold iron she had used to stir the embers of the stove. As Galt lunged into the room, Mara swung. She didn't swing with the weakness of a victim, she swung with the weight of every insult, every bruise, and every night she had spent shivering in the cold. The iron caught Galt across the wrist, the bone snapping with a sickening crunch. His gun clattered to the floor. Before the brute could recover, Eli was there. He didn't shoot. He used the butt of his rifle to deliver a crushing blow to Galt's temple, sending the man into a heap of unconsciousness. Eli looked at Mara, then at the iron poker in her hand. A small, grim smile touched his lips. "Nice swing," he said. In that moment, the instant karma was complete. The men who came to hunt a worthless woman had been defeated by her own hand and the protection of a man they had underestimated. But as the wind picked up, they both knew the true storm, Wade Carter, was still on the horizon. The morning didn't bring peace, it brought a funeral procession of the wealthy. The blizzard had died down into a haunting, silent frost, turning the world into a landscape of jagged glass. Inside the cabin, Eli and Mara didn't sleep. They spent the dawn hours cleaning the splintered wood and tending to the stove. Mara moved with a new sense of purpose, her movements no longer hesitant or bird-like. She had faced a predator and won. But as the sun crested the mountains, the sound of a dozen horses, and the heavy, rhythmic creak of a luxury carriage, broke the silence of the plains. Wade Carter had arrived. He didn't come like a thief in the night, he came like a king reclaiming a rebellious province. The carriage was black-lacquered and polished, pulled by 4 matched stallions that looked absurd against the rugged, blood-stained snow. Behind him rode 10 armed men, including the town's sheriff, a man whose badge was pinned more to Wade's payroll than to his shirt. They formed a wide semicircle around the cabin, a wall of iron and ego designed to crush any hope of resistance. Wade stepped out of the carriage, his fine silk suit and fur-lined coat a jarring insult to the surrounding poverty. He looked at the bodies of his men lying in the snow with nothing more than a flicker of annoyance. "Turner," he shouted, his voice smooth and cold, like a blade hidden in velvet. "I've spent a lot of money on those men you've broken. I don't like losing my investments. And I certainly don't like a common drifter and a room girl making me look foolish in front of my own town." He gestured to the sheriff, who stepped forward with a heavy Winchester leveled at the door. "Eli Turner," the sheriff called out, his voice tinged with a hidden shame. "You're under arrest for the murder of 3 men and the theft of Mr. Carter's legal property. Step out with your hands up, or we'll treat this cabin like a hornet's nest." Inside, Mara looked at Eli. She expected to see fear, or perhaps the grim resolve of a man about to die. Instead, she saw a transformation that made her breath catch. Eli had gone to the heavy wooden trunk at the foot of his bed. He pulled out a dark blue wool tunic, the brass buttons tarnished but still holding a ghost of their former brilliance. He slid it on, the fabric hugging shoulders that suddenly seemed twice as broad. He pinned a small, silver star to his chest, not a sheriff's badge, but a medal of valor from a war the world had tried to forget. "Wait here," Eli said to Mara. His voice wasn't a rasp anymore, it was a thunderous resonance that commanded the very air. He stepped out onto the porch, not as a hermit, but as a legend. The men outside froze. The sheriff's rifle wavered. They didn't see a low-status cowboy, they saw Captain Eli Turner, the hero of the Great Crossing, a man whose name was whispered in hushed tones by every soldier who had ever survived a losing battle. "Wade," Eli said, his voice carrying across the frozen yard like a clarion call. "You talk about property and investments. But you've forgotten one thing. This land doesn't belong to your ledger, and these people don't belong to your bed. You brought the law. Good. Because I'm holding the truth." Eli reached into his coat and pulled out a stack of soot-stained ledgers, the ones Mara had carried in her bundle. These weren't just records, they were the proof of Wade's decade-long reign of embezzlement, land theft, and murder. The reveal hit the men like a physical blow. The townspeople who had followed Wade out of fear began to murmur. They looked at the man in the blue coat, the man they had mocked as a broken soldier, and they saw the only person with the courage to stand against the monster. Mara stepped out onto the porch beside him, her head held high. She wasn't the worthless girl anymore. She was the witness. She was the spark. You think those books matter? Wade hissed, his face contorting with a sudden, ugly rage. I own the judge. I own the governor. You're nothing but a ghost in a dead uniform. He turned to his men. Kill them. Now. But for the first time in his life, the important man found himself standing alone. His men didn't move. They were looking at the captain. They were looking at the girl who had survived the storm. The instant karma of Wade's cruelty was finally catching up to him, and the price was going to be everything he owned. The air was so cold it felt like glass about to shatter. Wade Carter's face, usually a mask of aristocratic boredom, was now a distorted knot of panic and fury. Do your job, Sheriff, he screamed, his voice cracking and losing its cultured edge. I bought that badge for you. I pay for the roof over your children's heads. Shoot them. But the sheriff didn't move. He looked at Eli Turner, standing tall in his captain's tunic, his medals gleaming like stars against the dark blue wool, and then he looked at the ledgers in Mara's hands. The low-status hermit was revealed as the most powerful man on the plains, and the worthless girl held the key to Wade's prison cell. The power dynamic had shifted in a single heartbeat, and the instant karma that had been building since the first snowflake fell was finally ready to strike. Mara stepped forward, leaving the safety of the porch. She didn't have a gun, but she held the truth, which was far more lethal than lead. You told me I was nothing, Wade, she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent yard. You told me my life was just a debt to be paid and that I wasn't worth the dirt on your boots. But look at you now. You're the one who is bankrupt. You're the one who is truly alone. The townspeople who had followed Wade out of fear or greed began to step back, physically distancing themselves from the man who had built his empire on their suffering. The illusion of his importance had vanished. In its place was just a small, cruel man in a fancy coat, shivering in a wind that no longer obeyed him. Wade's eyes darted around like a trapped animal, looking for an escape that didn't exist. Seeing his empire crumbling, he lost his mind to desperation. He lunged for the sheriff's holster, intent on killing the two people who had exposed his soul to the light. But he was too slow. Eli moved with the lightning speed of a man who had survived 100 battles. He didn't fire a shot, he didn't need to. He caught Wade's wrist in a grip of iron and twisted, sending the important man to his knees in the freezing slush. Wade Carter, the master of Silver Creek, was sobbing in the dirt, his fine silk suit stained with the mud and blood of the world he had tried to conquer. It was the ultimate reversal, the king brought low by the very people he had stepped on. Take him, Eli commanded the sheriff. This time, the sheriff obeyed without hesitation, his shame finally outweighed by the weight of justice. And take these ledgers. Every name, every bribe, and every stolen acre is recorded. Mara made sure of that. She carried the weight of your crimes through a blizzard so the world could finally see you for what you are. As the carriage was turned around to haul Wade back to town as a common prisoner, the riders followed, their heads bowed. They were no longer an army, they were a broken group of men who had seen the true face of power. The plains grew quiet again, the only sound being the wind whispering through the pine trees, finally at peace. Mara looked at Eli, her eyes shining with tears that were no longer born of pain. He's gone, she whispered, the heavy weight of years of abuse finally lifting from her chest. He's really gone. Eli turned to her, the hardness in his face melting into a look of profound respect, a respect earned through fire and ice. He reached out and took her hand, his palm rough but incredibly warm. You did this, Mara. You chose to walk through the storm. You chose to keep those books when it would have been easier to drop them and save yourself. You saved this town long before you reached my door. I just provided the fire to keep you warm while you did it. Months later, the snow had surrendered to a vibrant, stubborn spring. The cabin was no longer a place of exile or a lonely fortress, it was the center of a small, thriving homestead. Mara had become a leader in Silver Creek, using the recovered funds to help others who had been cast out by the town's former greed. Eli had put away his uniform, but he kept his medals, not as symbols of war, but as reminders of the day he remembered how to be a hero for someone who needed him. They had proven that a warm bed isn't something to be traded for, but a dignity to be shared. And the lone cowboy and the girl who walked through the blizzard became a legend, a story told to every traveler about how the smallest person in the room can sometimes be the one who brings the giants to their knees.